Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, great. So what we're going to do is answer a survey, 2 questions at a time, and then come back together to discuss the answers. And you'll see Rachel's screen throughout our breakout session in the Zoom. And then we're going to ask that you answer the survey questions either in another internet window, in another tab, or on your device. So you don't ever need to click out of the breakout session, otherwise we won't be able to have a discussion with you. And before we move forward, I wanted to ask if everyone is familiar with Menti, with using Menti's online surveying, or if anyone needs further instruction on that.
Never used it before.
I have it either.
Okay, great, cool. That's really, actually, it's a great system. So maybe once you use it, you'll like to use it in your work in the future. So I can walk you through how to use it, and that's not a problem at all. Rachel is going to open up the survey and she'll put a link into our chat. Then you can follow that link. Okay, so it's...
Oh, there isn't a link. It's just go to menti.com.
Thanks, Rachel. I'll just put it here.
Yeah, just do www.menti.com in some device. And then when prompted, enter this code 9452326. And you should see this first question.
And before you answer, we're lucky today in our breakout session to actually have our presenters with us. And so since these topics were discussed yesterday, I was hoping very briefly that our presenters would be willing to just refresh all of our collective memory on the title of your talk, and if you'd like, just 1 or 2 sentences on what you discussed so that we can engage over those conversations together as a group. Sierra, would you mind starting us off with that?
I was busy coming up with my words. So the title of my talk was Planning and Responding to Drought and Fire, a collaborative approach to developing and utilizing customized climate products at Hawaii volcanoes. So this is work that we've been doing with Ryan Longman and Abby Frazier to get different products to help us better manage drought and fire over different spatial and temporal scales to take that metrics to management.
Thank you so much. Clay, would you mind going next?
Yeah, so I kind of gave an overview, so it was a little bit less about science, but really what's the patterns across the region. And so there's lots of fire in all these islands, and it's pretty much tied to these predictable drivers across all the space too. So it's like human ignitions, then these sort of fire-prone landscapes, and climate's going to make things worse, like everything else. But those drivers point to the solutions, and I think like implementing those things at the local scale, really thinking about like the park, the work that Sierra and those guys are doing, or any other project you can imagine, you're scaling those kinds of drivers down to local level. Sorry, my kids are chatting in the back.
No worries. And Abby, last but not least.
Sure. So my talk was titled Drought Knowledge Exchange in the Pacific Islands, and it was an overview of a lot of the drought research that we've been doing. So both categorizing drought impacts across different sectors, so meteorological drought, agricultural, hydrological, ecological, and socioeconomic. And then really launching into the recent work we've been doing with our partners in Hawaii on drought knowledge exchange. So as Sierra mentioned, working together to come up with customized site-specific data products that can help with drought decision making.
Thank you so much for refreshing everyone's memory. Was everyone able to access the Menti before I make any assumptions? Alan, do you need some help getting in?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. It's trying to ask me to set up a new account. Is that something I need to do?
No, you shouldn't have to.
Spell it with an I, not a Y. I did
I got
that.
in.
Pro tip.
Minty with an I.
Okay. Sorry, I get to that page and I see, forgive me, I'm not sure where to go from here. I just see a page that says do I click on your presentations?
No. You're at Mentimeter. You want menti.com, not Mentimeter. That's me. Go to menti.com.
Oh, okay, I'm
Oh
sorry.
yeah, so if you
No,
just
that's okay.
copy paste the link from the chat, that should take you where you want to be. Sorry for the confusion.
Sorry, guys. Okay, I'm there.
And you got the code 9452326.
Okay, I'm in. Thank you.
Great.
Awesome. Take your time. We've got plenty of time. And Dan, I know we can't see you, but you're in there and it looks like you answered. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's working for me.
Awesome. So full disclosure, I'm actually an urban planner, extension agent out of UH Manoa. And so fire and drought are not my area of expertise, but I'm a volunteer facilitator for our discussion today. So I'm going to do my best to lead an informed discussion, but if I say anything naive or uninformed, please do let me know. Okay, great. So now everyone has answered our first question. We just have 4. So the idea here is really to focus on the discussion. And what I'm going to do is take notes as we speak. And then I'll give a little synthesis summary for the rest of the group when we reconvene with the conference as a whole. So I know this is just a little word bubble, but if there's anything that anyone would like to say to build on their contribution, that would be wonderful. If not, I actually don't know what co-production means. So if the person who contributed that would mind elaborating.
I think that's one I typed in. So it's basically collaboratively producing knowledge. So it's working together. It's a two-way street. It's very discussion based and iterative, and not, one person coming up with an idea and telling another person. It's coming up with ideas and products and knowledge together.
Okay, great. So we have collaboration, local knowledge, and co-production, and those all seem like they go together. And then we also have anthropogenic fire, drought equals fire, and informative.
I was drought equals fire, and that's simply, you put drought and fire together in the same session, and there's basically a good reason for that, because fire is the most obvious manifestation of ecological drought when you get drought. And drought in itself is a low frequency, high impact event.
Okay, should we do question 2 and then we can talk about both of them?
Sure, yeah, thanks. So your screen should have changed. Let us know if you didn't.
Or it gives you a prompt that tells you that the screen has changed, and click on that and it'll bring you the next question.
Just to clarify, we can do longer answers for this one. You're not going to put it into a word cloud, right?
No, I think this one is distributed differently.
Okay.
I believe, I'm not sure.
This one you can also submit multiple times, so feel free to answer as many times as you'd like. So it looks like communication and collaboration are coming up a lot again. If you wouldn't mind expanding on how to make or how to translate science into communication and collaboration a little bit deeper, that would be great.
Well, mine's the comment of Marianne's. I mean, I really love how Marianne puts it, that, it's not just like lobbing the end product over the wall and saying like, managers, why aren't you just picking up my brilliant science and using it, that they're actually coming with you, that we're kind of on this, we're on this path together, and the researchers have needs and the managers have needs, but kind of going along together, I mean, when I think when Abby and I first started talking about the project that we've been working on now, we were out in Kipuka Key talking about the resource that actually we're most concerned about, that almost burned 2 years ago. So, having those kinds of relationships, I think really helps. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you for that. Are there any blocks to the application of science and in your research in the community? For instance, maybe not being trained in tools of communication or not knowing how to reach out to the right people, anything like that we should take note of?
Less like the inability to reach out, but sort of maintaining a dialogue and process of engagement, sort of being able to do that long enough for the right opportunities to emerge to see implementation. Because I mean, even like if you look at, I think about the Drought Knowledge Exchange and Abby and Sierra, like, it's the timing and emergence of projects and sort of the people who are kind of ready to use that information. And a similar example is like, I've been on Oahu working on fire stuff for 8 years, and finally with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, this nonprofit, we've gotten like the right people in place to actually see fuels mitigation in Waianae, which is burnt 6 times, in that 8 year period. And so, it takes time, and you got to just be around a lot of times.
In that regard, would you say it takes time for people to know that you're around, or is it just the time?
Yeah, both. So like, creating the opportunities, just like Sierra was saying, like those kinds of opportunities when you're out in the field and you can kind of get people together so that they become aware of that information, because they're not looking up these reports and they're not going to Google Scholar or whatever. And then also, I mean, as like researchers or whatever, but like seeing, you can identify risk in the context of fire, and we know when things are dangerous and risky. Wait 1 second, you. And then, but again, like having the capacity to implement change, like the capacity to like actually then respond to that information. I think that's really where fire management falls short. We have, like I said in the talk yesterday, it's not rocket science. Like if you want to reduce fire risk, we kind of know what to do. I think we can fine tune when and increase preparedness, but it's more along the lines, I think, of like a capacity issue where how do you reduce risk? In a simple perspective, just create a network of fire breaks, right? In a more complex perspective, reestablish community farms, like, so there's lots of different strategies that can be effective, but it's all like finding the right players at the right time. We're kind of ready to respond to that, the problem. And I think obviously it becomes a different situation at the national park, where you have like a mandate and different kinds of capacity and different kinds of resources that you're working with versus like a community that's on, on leeward Oahu, but where it gets maybe more complicated because you've got lots of moving pieces. I'll shut up. Thanks.
But I've even had like, even though I've been engaged, I've had a hard time engaging my own colleagues, and really, to get this. And the reality of it is, as managers, we're like in the emergency room, and it's like keeping the fences up, keeping out new weeds that are coming in, dealing with RUD, dealing with little fire ants. It's like
everything's a fire.
It's constant, and so really you are in this situation where you're just trying to stop the bleeding at this point. So it takes time to get people engaged in like, okay, this product will be good. This will help us, eventually, but you have to be able to trust that, because you have to invest your time in it as well. And your time invested in this is taking away from something else. And so it's almost like you need another level of translation from the manager to the other managers to get people to use it, that there's kind of these multi-level science translation processes that are going into making it actionable.
can I ask Sarah and
Yes.
other managers who are here, what is the form that would, I mean, I guess it varies from position to position, but what kind of form of products would be most useful? If, you know, it's clearly not just the written word, but is it online tools? Is it interactive maps? Is it hard copy things? I mean, what would be the way to engage and make that easier?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's something that our group has talked about actually quite a bit about what kind of products would be best. And it really is, you know, there's going to be different products for different audiences that work best. I was out in the field this morning working on a hazard tree project and just talking to the field firefighter about this project. And then it was like, okay, then I got him a little engaged. Okay, now I think I'll send him the 100-page portfolio and see if he'll help me, you know, translate it into the manager workbook. But I think that, you know, there's not a solve all product, you know, like we want a different product for our superintendent, like a one pager or like a bullet, you know, that she's just going to read super fast. She does not have time, you know, or you have a different product for somebody who's, you know, the fire program manager. So I think having a lot of different options, I know it's not, you know, an easy answer, but having products that are accessible. So one part of Abby's drought project is having something like PFX, but for drought, so that you have at least one place that you go to, you know, like what we're looking for, you know, what I'm utilizing for drought now is like the, you know, the US Drought Monitor, and, you know, I can't remember where the other one comes from, but it's like the 3 to 6 month, you know, INSO outlook. And so you're getting all of these things from a lot of different places. And so you are grabbing from different things. And so if there was at least one place, even if it was for different products, and I think that's part of the project, that certainly would be helpful.
Yeah, you know, drought, this is where drought and fire diverge, because you have fire every year to some extent, okay? And it's amenable to some levels of prevention. You can take certain steps on the landscape, etc. You can try to control ignition sources. Drought, you're not going to prevent. It's going to happen or it's not, because you don't control the climate. And drought happens less frequently. So there's a tendency for people to forget. Their focus drifts on years when you're not having drought. And frequently you go multiple years without any drought issues. There, once again, predictions, I think, are what comes back to the drought monitor, et cetera, where you can give people advance warning that drought is coming, because in a lot of Pacific jurisdictions, severe drought is a once in a decade issue. And so that's a long time between big droughts. And yet when they do hit, then suddenly you've got a problem.
Okay, great. I think that might speak to our next question. So I'm going to ask Rachel to take us there now. And by the way, all of these responses are being recorded, and we're going to save all these responses and share them with PI-CASC to inform their future efforts. So now we want to think about the research that we're hoping will be done in the coming years. What are the management needs that we want to consider addressing, and what would we like to be seeing come out of PI-CASC?
Not a big question at all.
Right.
Yeah, and which part of resource management?
That's a good question too. Feel free to make it as specific or general as comes to mind for your interest area. Like the clearinghouse that you mentioned, Sierra, that might be an idea here too. Feel free to indicate here too if there's shorter term needs versus mid to longer term needs that you'd like to see, particularly if it's a key short term need that would inform longer term work. You might have already figured out, but on this one you can also submit multiple times if you'd like. So one thing that came up in the last question as well was the need for translation between academia or maybe journal outputs and more readily understandable community-friendly outputs, and the need for boundary organizations, which is great to see. Are any of these ideas that have been proposed sort of fundamental to being able to move forward in the future, or something that you would identify as a shorter term need or priority for PI-CASC to focus on? If not, that's okay.
I mean, this is almost cliche, but can you guys, this is almost cliche, but I mean, in the sense of like case studies and the value that case studies have, which I think is a cool approach. Again, like the Drought exchange is kind of taking, I think there's so much variability in how practices are implemented. So what's another cool thing about fire, like I keep saying, it's like the actions to reduce risk are pretty straightforward. What's less known is like, how do you what's the most effective way, and is there like variability in how you approach doing those actions in different places? So for example, like on the Pacific Islands, you're dealing mostly with like private lands and communal land, community lands, versus trying to tackle that in Hawaii, where you're kind of dealing with like small householders into these like larger extents of state lands, for example. And so it's like the mess of implementation is like not so clear. Like, and I think that's what everyone's craving. I mean, personally, when you go a lot of these like climate change focused talks, it's like, what does the actual actions look like, and how do you get them done? And I think that's what I after, again, working on fire over these years, that's the frustration. It's like you can point to the right actions, but people just don't have the resources to do it. And what you end up doing is relying a lot on these just communities just coming together and making stuff happen. So how do you facilitate that? And how do you and again, like thinking about investment, right? Like how do you invest wisely, like within these areas to make those things happen? Sorry.
Well, the other point is that the adaptation strategies, and let's go back to drought, are different between different jurisdictions. If you look at the infiltration to runoff ratios, okay? In Hawaii, you've got a lot of infiltration, you've got aquifers, okay? In a place like Palau, the surface is extremely impermeable, so almost all the rain runs off. So even though Palau, hectare per hectare, is wetter than Hawaii, a drought hits it a lot faster because it's all reservoir storage, right? And it doesn't have anything held inside the mountain. So, you have to realize that you have to adapt your strategy. Even if you have great prediction and say, Palau, Hawaii, you're both going to have a drought, you might take very different approaches into how you're going to anticipate and deal with that.
So a real need for place-based practitioners who understand a little bit better than just like a, Pacific-wide screening tool can tell you.
Yeah, to some, this is where you have to have both the science and then how do you implement that locally, right?
I mean, if there's one takeaway that from the previous talks that were given, which is that just the resolution needs to be really high, right? To do the spatial mapping that we're kind of talking about, and anticipating different ecological scenarios under different climate change scenarios, transition zones widening or shrinking, between invasive and native species, for example. So I think most managers, I mean, speaking for myself in the previous capacity as a manager, are going to be looking, for really good maps, really good high resolution information by which we can figure out where to put fire breaks, where to anticipate changes coming down the pike, so to speak.
And yet at the same time, we've had a tremendous loss of resolution, if you will, with our data networks in the past 30 or 40 years, especially outside Hawaii, because GS used to supply all of that. And as GS's budget got cut, they started cutting back on precipitation gauges, stream gauges, et cetera. So we were much better gauged in the 1960s in places like Yap and Palau than we are now. And so we're relying on other tools to try to work out rainfall, but NexRad and satellite detection there's no substitute for ground-based measurements,
It's interesting that you say that, because I noticed that we didn't have a lot of responses in the last few questions about funding, but that definitely indicates that there needs to be more robust investment here in the future.
Well, budgets for most of these agencies have just been declining, 5% on 5% for years. So it was just slow bleed, but it all adds up finally in terms of a loss of data continuity.
Hey, Rachel, we've got one more. This question gives you options with dots, is what I've been told. So you can choose multiple options. I believe up to 4.
And not all these choices are mutually exclusive, obviously.
Certainly, yes. Yeah. Please feel free to choose more than one option. I'm sure that ultimately the critical mass will indicate for PI-CASC which directions they want to move in.
Don't be so sure.
Well, we are
All over the map.
So far, it looks like everything.
Yes.
The new administration coming in, we hope will be good for us. But there are certain mandates that we have, and funding streams can go to some things and not others, stuff like that. So
yeah, but people are policy, and you will have a different set of priorities.
we'll see what happens.
It can only go one direction at this point.
Well, that is something that I'm hopeful for, out of this work with Abby and Ryan, is that, it'll give us a foundation to create some new proposals and things. We're hoping, we haven't had many climate change or anything like that funding sources. So when those come up, we're hoping, I definitely have some new ideas from this work that I think that we'll be able to use this data, hopefully, to be able to provide a foundation to build some capacity. But that's just if those opportunities come up.
Yeah.
It looks like supporting interdisciplinary research got 4, so it's one of our top 2 out of a mostly even board of responses. So as an urban planner, I'm curious if you as expert practitioners ever get involved with community planning processes, or contributing about urban wildlife or wildfire, interfaces, creating buffer zones, places that have exceeded their sustainable yield for aquifer recharge, things like that when it comes to drought. So just my own curiosity.
Yeah, it's such an interesting mix of infrastructure and vegetation management. And, like a lot of times in the infrastructure side of things, like there's things that you can take short term that are like a smarter investment than trying to figure out like a big fuels management project. But it's definitely, and then I think the other side of that, like the interface part of how it directly affects communities. So there's an opportunity with fire also to just increase awareness, right? That like our actions are directly connected to these forest resources and marine stuff that maybe we're not. Actually, I think marine stuff people are probably more connected to, broadly speaking, than some of the forest stuff, the forest and Malka stuff. But yeah, you have a really cool opportunity to bridge lots of different groups, and that's been my biggest experience over the years working on fire stuff. Is like you get to sit at the table with like ranchers, farmers, land managers, private landowners, homeowners. It really brings people out and people together to tackle this stuff. The flip side of it, though, is that also it kind of echoes this general pattern of a lack of investment in land management across the board. Like the reason that the risk is so high and has become, especially in Hawaii, it sort of reveals where we're sort of failing in that respect.
It's interesting with fire, though, because unlike the mainland, just in the last couple of years, we still don't have a major problem with fire crossing the urban wildland interface to a great extent, right? It's still more of a wildland problem than it is a problem of those border zones, shall we say.
I mean, it's a little nefarious there because, like, But talk to people who live on Maui or West Maui, and they probably would argue very differently from that perspective. But it's that idea that, yeah, we are dealing with these grassland fuels that are a little bit easier to deal with. But we've already seen examples. 2018 is a really clear example that we were maxed out. Like the whole fire department was like on call for these big fires we had on Oahu. And we're lucky we only lost a couple homes, couple structures. It's like the potential for this place to burn sort of at any given moment, really, like when we see these either seasonal drought or, the normal dry season cycles or out of season drought, we're incredibly vulnerable. And I think an even better example is when we lost 23 homes on Maui was because we had a fire burning as Lane was bearing down. I mean, they were evacuating hurricane shelters. And it's kind of crazy because, again, it's like preventable. I mean, maybe you can't stop all fires, but you can reduce risk, right? And we're not really like thinking, or we don't have enough people kind of at critical mass to be thinking like, oh, what we do up there kind of matters for us down here.
Your point on Maui is really well taken, but if you think about it, that was more the plantation going out and turning into a giant mass of weeds, right? Which wasn't necessarily driven by climate as much as by economic factors, right? It's still a big fire problem, but it's not necessarily a climate-driven fire problem.
Interesting, which I imagine will get worse with climate.
Yeah.
Well, but it's something to think about because you have these landscapes turning over post-agriculturally as the last of the plantations go out. What do you want to do with them? I think somebody did a Bob Hoppers and said, what do we want the forest to look like, right? Well, what do we want Maui to look like post-plantation? Mahipona's got one view of it, but there could be other views of what you could turn those lands into.
That's exactly the question. It's just like, do you want it what it is? And what it is right now is just these savannas, the tropical savannas that burn all the time. And some people actually value those landscapes, like we did these community group work on Kaupulehu on the Big Island and talking about different scenarios that you could imagine that landscape in. And people were like, we like native forests, but we want pasture, So yeah, but I don't know for, again, like even if what we want, how do you actually implement those changes? It's hard.
Right.
I want to thank you all for your input. We're coming down to the wire with getting back into the main session group, and I want to give everyone the time to be able to do that. But before we do, we've been requested to do a Hollywood Squares group photo. So if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to count down and I'll do the 3, 2, 1 screenshot. Ready?
Did we lose Melissa or is her camera just off?
Oh, Melissa, are you still there?
Because I see that we have supposed to have 8 people. Yes, she is still here, but her camera's off. Melissa, turn on your camera if you want to be in the picture. Or not.
All right. Unfortunately, I should have done it earlier. All right, let's try it. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Thanks, guys. Good sports. Okay, great. So Rachel, thank you so much for your technical support. She put instructions in the chat for us about how to get back to the main room, as well as the password. I hope you enjoyed trying out Menti. Maybe it's something you can use for community engagement in the future. It's a free tool. It's really simple once you get in there, and the community likes to use their smartphones during meetings, and I found it to be a cool interactive way to meet with the community. And thank you to our younger participants as well, Clay. And we'll see you all back in the main group. So thanks again.
All right, thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.